Thank you, Dr. Smeltzer. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here this evening. I have been friends for a long time with Ron and Ruth Smeltzer, and this is my third trip to Salt Lake City and my second at Dr. Smeltzer's instigation. I'm pleased to be here tonight also as part of the special programs that are being conducted in concurrence with Yom HaShoah this year, and in particular with the opening of the Anne Frank exhibit on Sunday. What I'd like to talk about tonight, and by the way, when I finish my remarks, unless there is some other procedure that we follow in doing questions and answers, I'll be glad to answer as many questions as I can as any of you may want to pose, because in an occasion like this and a subject of this nature, this particular subject is never bereft of questions. I'd like to begin by reading one of what I consider to be the most eloquent paragraphs written in the 20th century by anyone. It was written by Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, who was the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and it comes from part of his opening statement saying to the tribunal and to the world why the victorious Allies had chosen to put on trial the principal 22 perpetrators still living at the time who were responsible for the Nazi regime and its crimes. Justice Jackson said the following: "The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason." One were a writer, one could retire on a paragraph written like that. The men who were in the dock at Nuremberg were, in large measure, the principal perpetrators of what we have come to know in history as the Holocaust. But there were some who were not at Nuremberg, who, had they been alive, would have been. And two of the principal perpetrators of the Holocaust, Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, were absent because of death. Heydrich because of his assassination. Actually, I like to think that he was really executed rather than assassinated by the Czechs in June of 1942. Heydrich by virtue of his assassination by the Czechs, and Himmler by virtue of the suicide he committed after he had been captured and recognized by the British in May of 1945. And it's to the one of the two perpetrators tonight that I would like to direct my remarks in trying to shed some light on how and why it became possible for a nation of advanced science and academics and civilization and culture to undertake the greatest deliberate process of human destruction in the lifetime of man. How is it that the nation of Brahms and Luther and Bach and Schiller was able to descend into an abyss of criminality unprecedented in the modern civilized age? Part of the reason lies in the generational experience of the age cohort to which Reinhard Heydrich belonged. Reinhard Heydrich was born in the fairly picturesque city of Halle in Saxony in March of 1904. He was 10 years old when the First World War broke out. He was 14 years old when the First World War ended. He was too young to experience combat in his adolescence, but he was alert enough, he was conscious enough, and politically attuned enough to be influenced by all of the privations and hardships, the distress, the turmoil, and the turbulence that affected the civilian population of Germany throughout the war, especially from 1916 until the end of the conflict. He was born into a fairly prominent family. His father, Bruno Heydrich, was a fairly well-known and accomplished opera singer and composer. His mother, Heydrich's mother, Elizabeth Krantz Heydrich, was the daughter of the founder and director of the Halle Conservatory of Music. It was a musical academic family. Heydrich was the middle child, an older sister and a younger brother. Up until the beginning of the First World War, the family prospered, and his childhood, fairly normal by anybody's standards, was punctuated only by the difficulties created by his eccentricities. He was an awkward child. He was very tall physically. He was ungainly. He was shy and reticent, didn't make friends easily, and was susceptible to being teased and bullied. He retreated into a world of his own in this regard, and musical instruments became his friends, particularly the violin and the cello, both of which he excelled in mastering, along with other musical instruments. He attended a gymnasium and did fairly well in his studies. There was nothing wrong with his intellect at all. He had an attitude problem noted by his teachers, but was a child who was able to achieve and learn rapidly. His father, in particular, emphasized the importance of sports and athletics to the young Reinhard Heydrich. To overcome his awkward, ungainly, uncoordinated physical lack of abilities, he was encouraged to engage in playing soccer. He became something of a champion high school swimmer. He learned sailing. He became interested in horses and took up equestrian riding. And he learned something about aviation as a teenager as well. Like those of his generation, he was traumatized by the defeat that the German armies experienced in the First World War and the upheavals that tore German society apart in 1919 and 1920. He was attracted to right-wing, radical, nationalist organizations, spokespersons, and literature, like most of the impressionable German teenagers his age. He was a fanatical nationalist, and like the civilian population in Germany, he accepted the explanation of Germany's defeat presented by the generals, Ludendorff, Hindenburg, and the others, that the German army had not really lost the war to the Allies in 1918, but had been stabbed in the back at home by politicians, by Jews, by socialists and communists, by people who were too weak and who lacked the patriotism and dynamism and national fervor to see the country through the hardships to victory. He took that propaganda to heart, as did millions of other young Germans his age at the time. In the aftermath of war, and his father's business running the conservatory in Halle fell on hard times. You can imagine that in an era of political upheaval and economic depression and turmoil, a music conservatory is not going to do very well. And Heydrich's parents fell on hard times. To have any prospects for success once he got his Abitur and finished the equivalent of college preparatory high school, he elected to try a career in the Navy. He took the entrance exams, he passed, in fact he did very well, and he was mustered into the Navy with the officer cadet class of 1922 and would remain in the Navy for the next 9 years. In the Navy, Heydrich did very well. He excelled at learning how to use wireless signals equipment to encrypt radio messages and to decrypt radio messages. He learned all of the mechanical and technical things that a signals officer in a modern 20th century Navy had to know. And he spent, of the 9 years that he was in the Navy, he probably spent 5 of those years at sea on a variety of German ships, including the old battleship Brandenburg, the cruiser Schleswig-Holstein, the cruiser Berlin, and the training ship Niobe. The Navy became an important crucible for Heydrich. He passed through this in his 20s. In 1931, however, it all came crashing into ruin as a result of a personal and social crisis that he created for himself. Heydrich became infatuated with a young woman, then only 20. Her name was Lena von Osten. He met her at a social gathering in Kiel in northern Germany, where the Navy had its main station. And after only 2 or 3 dates, he asked this young woman to marry him. Even though she was astonished, she consented. She took him home to meet her parents, and they placed an announcement of their forthcoming intention, their engagement and their intention to marry. They placed an announcement in local newspapers. The problem with this felicitous development was that Heydrich at the time had won the affections of another young woman who assumed that she was engaged to him because of the advanced nature of their relationship, shall we say, in tiptoeing around the thing kind of genteelly here. And to Heydrich's misfortune, the other young lady, the compromised young lady's father, was a very influential person in Kiel who was responsible. He was a contractor and a former naval officer who was responsible for supplying the German Navy with vital supplies. And he was a close friend of the 2 principal admirals in the German Navy at that time, Erich Raeder and Hermann Kleikamp. And the aggrieved daughter's father went to the admirals, and the admirals said, "We can't have a young naval officer engaging in behavior of this kind." They convened a court of honor, and Heydrich would have gotten off, and his naval career would not have been wrecked had he not been arrogant and supercilious in front of these admirals and acted like the young woman had made all this up. The admirals didn't like his attitude, they didn't like his conduct, and they didn't like his arrogance, and they cashiered him from the Navy. You could do that actually then. You could be kicked out of the Navy in Germany for having basically an illicit kind of relationship with a single young woman. Code of conduct for officers was something taken very seriously. So here it is, March of 1931. The world was in the depths of the Great Depression. There were over 7.5 million unemployed people in Germany. There was no Social Security. There was no unemployment compensation. There were none of the social safety nets that societies have in this day and age. And here is this young man who wasn't even in the Navy long enough to qualify a pension, who's now been put out on the street by the Navy. Well, he and Lena von Osten carried through their plans to get married, and they became man and wife in the autumn of 1931. In the meantime, Heydrich's mother does what lots of mothers who dote on their grown sons do. She wanted to help him get a job. She didn't want to have him sitting around the house and back on the family payroll. So she interceded with a family in the local aristocracy in Saxony named von Eberstein, and she talked to her godson, Friedrich Karl von Eberstein, who was already not only a member of the Nazi Party in the early 30s, but was also a member of the SS and was also familiar with Heinrich Himmler, the young head of the SS. Von Eberstein knew that Himmler was looking for an intelligence officer for the SS to create an intelligence service for the SS, and recommended that Heydrich go see Himmler, which Heydrich did. They met at Himmler's chicken farm in Waldtrudering in Bavaria in the summer of 1931. Himmler was recovering from the flu and was in an ill disposition, and simply said to Heydrich, well, why don't you just sit down and write out what you think the SS intelligence service should look like. Just diagram it on paper. So Heydrich did. 20 minutes later, Himmler came back and looked at it and said, I think you're the man I'm looking for. The other reason Himmler said that was because if anybody did not look like the SS officer from Central Casting, it was Heinrich Himmler. Nobody was further away from the sort of racial stereotype that the Nazis like to project of the Aryan Superman than Heinrich Himmler. There was nobody who looked more like the SS officer from Central Casting than Reinhard Heydrich. 6'4", blonde, blue-eyed, muscular, graceful, a man who not only could do well in a whole group of sports, fencing, riding, sailing, swimming, but who was also learning to fly an airplane. He would later become a fighter pilot in the Second World War. In addition to running the Holocaust, he flew Me-109s in combat and did not do badly. But Heydrich had also in the Navy acquired skills that were indispensable for anybody who knew how to apply the technical advances in 20th century communication to the art and the science of gathering intelligence. Heydrich understood that. And Himmler understood that about Heydrich from the beginning. And so the two of them set to work to create what would become the SD, the security service of the SS. Heydrich had literally found himself, and he set to work with enthusiasm, and over the next 2 years he gradually built the SD as an SS organization into a reliable source that gathered valuable political intelligence on the other political parties that were still extant in Germany at the time, particularly the communists and the socialists. Himmler and Heydrich's relationship developed in the process. The two men worked together very well. In fact, there's a later member of the German resistance, Hans Baron Gisevius, who later in 1944 remarked on this relationship and said, Heydrich without Himmler was nothing. Himmler with Heydrich was everything, meaning that the relationship made possible what the two of them together created. And what they did was this. In January of 1933, when Hitler legally came to power, with the chancellorship vested in him by the aging President von Hindenburg, Heydrich and Himmler, as part of the rearrangement and the spoils of the Nazis getting office, Himmler became chief of the political police in Bavaria, in Munich, and he brought Heydrich in with him as sort of his chief of staff. Very quickly, they began to transform the existing bureaucratic and governmental structure in Bavaria, in the police and in the other agencies, into agencies populated by Nazi officials and SS men. Gradually, over the next 3 years, they spread their control of police organizations from Bavaria throughout the rest of Germany. Until Adolf Hitler came to power, police powers in Germany were vested the way they are in our country. They were federalized powers. The police powers were vested in the individual states in Germany. Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, Schaumburg-Lippe, Schleswig-Holstein, Hanover, and Prussia, the largest of the German states. In a period of 3 years, Himmler and Heydrich managed to gain control of the police forces one after another in all these German states, the biggest prize being control of the police forces in Prussia, relinquished by Hermann Goering in late 1934. In the process, they took over an organization that Goering had already created in Prussia, called the Secret State Police, Geheime Staatspolizei, or, as a postal clerk abbreviated it, Gestapo. And in 1934, when Himmler became the chief of the Gestapo, Heydrich became his deputy. In 1936, when Hitler finally formalized the control of the national police force in Germany in Himmler's hands, Himmler became Reichsführer SS and chief of the German police. And Heydrich became chief of the security police and the SD. This is important for two reasons. First of all, beginning in 1936, Germany has what it's never had before. It has police power taken from the states and centralized at the national level in Berlin. That police power is not centralized in a traditional agency or ministry of the government. It is centralized in an organization of the Nazi Party, the SS. And from 1936, SS and police become synonymous. Now, in the process, Heydrich underwent a kind of conversion to what the historian Claudia Kuntz has called the Nazi conscience. Most of us recoil at the idea of such a concept, that one could be a Nazi and have a conscience. But Claudia Kuntz has looked at this in the cultural terminology of Germany in the 1930s. And what it meant was one's value system, one's notion of right and wrong became anchored in the idea that what was done for the racial community, the Aryan acceptable Germans, was good. That was right. What could also be done to the enemies of the people's community, of the racial communities, Jews, gypsies, asocials, communists, socialists, shirkers, alcoholics, chronically unemployed people, things that could be done to these people by the police to remove them from society were also right. There was nothing wrong with that. And in the process, Heydrich formulated ideas that have, I think, a direct straight line to genocide, beginning in 1940 and 41. The first is the idea that the police should have powers that are absolutely unlimited. They should not be circumscribed. And toward this end, the SS and police forces developed a procedure called protective custody, Schutzhaft. One could be arrested by a Gestapo agent. The agent would have a protective custody warrant with him that had been signed by a Gestapo official, not been issued by a judge. And on the act of arrest, after the act of arrest, the subject arrested would not be taken to a jail and booked. He would be taken to a concentration camp and processed into the concentration camp by the SS officers who were responsible for running the camp. And once in the concentration camp, he could be kept there indefinitely. There was no right to appeal. There was no issue of habeas corpus. There was no way to protect one's right and one's freedom against this police intrusion. And as the 30s progressed, they broadened the use of it. In 1937, in the summer of 37, for example, Heydrich directed a huge roundup of known criminals. Now think of it if you're a law enforcement officer. You've been dealing with the same group of fellows who've been committing robberies or who are committing petty crimes. And you know who they are. And they commit a crime and they may be jailed and then they spend a little time, then they're out, and then they're recidivists. They commit the crime again. Well, if you're Heydrich, you have a simple way of dealing with that. You simply have them arrested on a protective custody warrant, you have them thrown in a concentration camp, and they're not going to come out again. They've been removed from society. As Heydrich said in 1937, why should we tolerate having to wait on these people harming society again when we know who they are and we know what we can do with them? We'll put them away. Heydrich's office and Heydrich's collaborators also developed the attitude that since Hitler considered the Jews to be Germany's most insidious, perfidious, lethal enemy, that the task of the police would be to make life for Jews in Germany so unbearable that they would eventually have to leave. They would come to the point where they would see that there was no future for them in Germany, and they would leave. And by 1938, Heydrich and the police had gained control, were gaining control of the actual exercise of the regime's anti-Jewish policies. The other contribution Heydrich made in this crucial decade of the 1930s to the process of genocide was as a talent scout. Heydrich had an uncanny ability to pick out young men who were susceptible to the same kinds of ideas who were as committed to the idea of creating a Nazi new order as he was. And these were not young men of indifferent background and character. These were young men of education and accomplishment. Werner Best, Heinrich Müller, Dr. Helmut Knochen, Karl Albrecht Oberg, Otto Ohlendorf, Dr. Franz Alfred Sieks, the so-called Tübingen trio, Erich Erlinger, Dr. Martin Sandberger, and Dr. Irvin Weinmann. These were all young men who left promising careers as attorneys, as economists, as government officials, and in the case of Irvin Weinmann, as the chief of the hospital at the University of Tübingen. Weinmann was an MD. They left promising careers in order to join this elite new police force directing the final stage of the consolidation of Nazi power. These would become the men who who commanded the units that did the actual killing once the Holocaust began. Heydrich's contributions in the 30s to so many of the things that became identified with the Nazi conduct of genocide were such that they're almost innumerable. This yellow star that I'm wearing now was originally proposed as a badge that would be involuntarily inflicted upon Germany's Jews in a ministerial conference that was conducted on the 12th of November, 1938. This was a conference that Hermann Goering convened to discuss how they're going to deal with all the damage that had been done in the anti-Semitic riots and the pogroms that followed the murder of the German counselor in Paris in what became known as the Reichskristallnacht. Huge damage done. Most of the windows in the stores that were smashed in Germany were made out of Belgian glass, which meant because there weren't German firms that made that kind of glass. So it created a problem, not only who's going to pay for the damage, but how are they going to get that much Belgian glass made to revive these businesses, because the businesses were going to be Aryanized, taken away from their Jewish owners. But in that conference, Heydrich raised the question of, one, whether or not to further separate Jews from German society by marking them with a badge, and two, whether or not at some point to consider putting them in segregated areas in cities. And three, he proposed something that opened the door to genocide. He proposed the creation of what would be called the Central Office for Jewish Immigration. He proposed to consolidate all of the procedures and policies that would forcibly get Jews out of Germany and Austria by putting it in the hands of his SS and police officers, and he had just the young man for the job who would actually run the office. His name was Adolf Eichmann, and he was running such an office in Vienna, and Heydrich brought him from Vienna to Berlin to take over the same process for Germany as a whole. That process, of course, ended in 1939 with the outbreak of war. Heydrich did something else in employing all of these highly educated, highly motivated, sophisticated young men who were to become the killers of the 1940s. He organized them into what were called Einsatzgruppen. The term is Heydrich's. Action groups, SS action groups. And he used them to go after political enemies in the countries that Germany annexed and gobbled up semi-peacefully in 1938 and 1939. The first SS action units, the first SS Einsatzgruppen, went into Austria at the time of the Anschluss in March of 1938. They ran down political opponents, they seized archives, they conducted special intelligence tasks, but mainly they were sent in to try to capture known enemies of the Nazis before they could get away. Another Einsatzgruppen went into Czechoslovakia in March of 1939 when Hitler invaded and occupied the rest of Bohemia after the Munich Conference. And then, of course, in Poland, in September of 1939, Heydrich's Einsatzgruppen, for the first time, transformed what had become, at Heydrich's instigation, in SS and police rule, what had been a climate of killing in Germany, killing inmates in concentration camps, killing people arrested on protective custody warrants, killing Jews at the time of the Reichskristallnacht. What had been a climate of killing before 1939 now became a culture of murder. The Einsatzgruppen were sent into Poland with specific orders to round up and liquidate as many of the leaders of Polish national life as they could find, primarily Jews, but also members of the Catholic clergy, members of the Polish nobility, members of the Polish national government, members of Polish local governments, mayors, leading intellectuals, particularly writers and artists, people whose work visualized Polish national life, Heydrich considered dangerous. And in a course of 9 or 10 months, Heydrich's units and other SS and police formations murdered 60,000 Poles. As Heydrich said, the Fuhrer's objective was to decapitate Polish national leadership and therefore prevent, for all time, the Polish nation from rising again. Jews who had not been the principal victims in the first wave of the killings became principal victims in the second wave of the killings. And as war after September of 1939 was a given factor, Heydrich's objective now became what to do with respect to the compounding problem that Germany was having with Jews. You see, up until 1938-39, the SS and police objective was to chase as many Jews out of Germany and Austria as possible. Get them to go somewhere else. Palestine, Cuba, Argentina, Brazil, United States, wherever. Get rid of them forcibly by immigration. But now with war, that was no longer possible. Moreover, every time Germany conquered a country, it added rather than subtracted to the number of Jews that it had on its hands. With the conquest of Poland in September of 1939, Germany added 3.5 million Jews to the 400,000 that were left in Germany and Austria just before the outbreak of the war. With the conquest of France and the Low Countries in the spring of 1940, another 100 or 200,000 were added to the mix. And very clearly in the summer of 1940, Heydrich saw that the penultimate stage in the Hitlerian program for conquest and domination in Europe, namely the attack on the Soviet Union, which would come the following spring, that step would add another estimated 5.5 million Jews to the territories controlled by Germany. What to do about this? In a sharply worded letter written to the foreign minister, the Reich foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, in June of 1940, Heydrich had learned that Ribbentrop, in Heydrich's view, had been trying to mess in Heydrich's bailiwick by proposing solutions to the Jewish problem in conversations with his Italian counterpart, the Italian foreign minister Galeazzo Ciano. And what Ribbentrop had proposed was that they ship all the European Jews to Madagascar, an island in the Indian Ocean. Well, this is a fantastically improbable, totally impossible task. If you anticipated, as the Germans did, that there were 11.5 million Jews in Europe, how many freighters do you think it would take to ship that many people from Europe all the way to the Indian Ocean? Heydrich had spent 9 years in the Navy. He knew something about ship tonnage and knew that this was practically impossible. He wrote Ribbentrop basically reminding the foreign minister that Hitler had given him, Heydrich, the responsibility for getting rid of the Jews, not the foreign ministry. And secondly, telling the foreign minister on the record that what would now be required would be a territorial final solution to the Jewish question, meaning that the Jews would have to be gotten rid of some way on the European continent. Not specified beyond that, but a territorial final solution. And I think Heydrich, in June of 1940, is very clearly looking to the possibility, the probability, the opportunity that somehow the methodology would be developed or would become available to physically exterminate all the European Jews under German control. Certainly in the spring of 1941, as the plans for the German attack on the Soviet Union developed, that possibility became much closer. On Hitler's personal warrant, Himmler and Heydrich were ordered to create special SS Einsatzgruppen that would go into the Soviet Union right behind the units of the German army and round up and kill as many of the local communist functionaries, political commissars of the Red Army, local Communist Party officials, Jews, saboteurs, agitators. The list of people to be killed kept growing longer and longer every time Heydrich sent out a directive to the SS men under his command. Who would command and staff these SS murder commandos? All of these bright, intelligent, university-educated, academically sophisticated young men who had been attracted to the SS and police in the 1930s. They became the mass murderers of the first phase of the Holocaust. Otto Ohlendorf, Martin Sandberger, Erich Erlinger, Irvin Weinman, Horst Böhme, all of these young men. Best was the sole exception. Werner Best, who had been Heydrich's closest collaborator and deputy in the 1930s, he and Heydrich had a falling out, and Best left the SS and police in 1940 and probably saved his own life as a result of that, because had he remained, he would have ended up in the dock either at Nuremberg in the trial of the major war criminals, or he would have been tried by the American Army with the other Einsatzgruppen commanders at the end of the Second World War. Now, when the process of trying to murder millions of people by shooting all of them to death individually began to break down, there were problems, of course, with ammunition. There were problems with the locations, because all of these killings were being done in the open air. They were being done semi-publicly in areas in Russia. They were attracting crowds. There's even a photograph of one mass killing in which members of a local army band can be seen watching what is going on. People were taking pictures of this. Soldiers were sending letters home with photographs. Every German soldier had his little Leica taking black and white snapshots of all of the subhumanity in the East. And this stuff got out of hand and became public knowledge. Moreover, it was causing tremendous psychological stress among the young SS men who were charged with actually doing the shooting. It wasn't so much that killing unarmed, defenseless, innocent Jewish men bothered them, but having to shoot Jewish women and children got under their Nazi skins. It went down even below their Nazi conscience. And some of these fellows resorted to serious alcoholism. A couple committed suicide. Others had nervous breakdowns. The point became that there had to be some other way to accomplish the final solution to the Jewish question other than trying to shoot 11.5 million people individually. The process involved, ultimately, of course, gassing the victims to death, first with carbon monoxide and then with Zyklon B, a prussic acid-based gas that causes the destruction of the inner linings of the lung and induces death in about 10 minutes. It was used first as a pesticide against lice, and Himmler thought that was especially appropriate for the use against Jews, because Himmler said Jews, lice, and bed bugs are all basically the same, and you exterminate the Jews the same way you get rid of the lice and the bed bugs. Well, instead of taking the killers to the victims, as was happening in all these villages in Russia where these mass shootings were taking place, they would reverse the process. They would now bring the victims to the killers. And to that end, the permanent concentration camps, particularly at Auschwitz and Majdanek, Auschwitz in Silesia, Majdanek in the Lublin district of the General Government of Poland, and then specially constructed camps that were to be temporary extermination facilities, Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The Jews of Europe would be gassed to death there. And Heydrich oversaw each step and every stage of this part of the process until he was assassinated in the spring of 1942. In his honor, and to express and cherish his memory, Himmler named officially the process of exterminating the Jewish population of Poland Aktion Reinhard, or Action Reinhard, in Heydrich's honor. What a posthumous accolade to carry with you after you've gone, having a process of mass murder named for you. What can you draw from the experience of someone like Heydrich? Heydrich grew up in a privileged family. Despite the uproar, the upheavals of the First World War, he survived intact through his young adulthood. He was a man who brought out of the naval experience, even though it ended tragically or traumatically for him, he brought nevertheless back into civilian life talents and knowledge that could have made him a success in any number of career opportunities. What do you draw from the inferences that when the American Army, the American prosecuting authorities put on trial in 1947, 24 of the leaders of these SS murder commandos that Heydrich had organized and sent into the Soviet Union, all of these men, all of them, without exception, were highly educated. Paul Blobel, who commanded a special unit that disinterred the bodies in the mass burial sites in the Soviet Union and burned them in order to try to obliterate the evidence, Paul Blobel was the least well-educated, and he was an architect by training. What do you make of all this? That so many of these young men were willing to reverse basically the cultural and intellectual and academic construct upon which they had been taught as young men, and to become willingly mass murderers. There's a new book by a young woman, a young historian named Hilary Earle, about this trial. And one of the conclusions she draws in being, I think she was as stunned by having to confront the fact that so many of these young men who were so well educated became perpetrators of genocide, when, as many of us did years ago, she would have assumed the opposite in beginning, that the people who are capable of perpetrating genocide are ill-educated, ignorant brutes and sadists. That was not the case with these young men. And the conclusion she draws is that, unfortunately, education does not seem to be a hindrance to the temptation to commit genocide. Education tends to be a facilitator of the temptation to commit genocide, as is evidenced in the life and form of all these young men. Now, among the historical works that are being written today, there's an interesting reversal that's being undertaken. In the 1960s, when Professor Smeltzer and I were much younger and thinner than we are now, he doesn't have any more hair now than he had then. I have less now than I had then. But when we came up in a generation in which the young historians who were looking at the Nazi past were either British or American historians, because the Germans were too traumatized by their past to deal with it at that point. There was no, when I was a student at the University of Freiburg in 1969, there was no course in the curriculum of the university that even dealt with the National Socialist period. The most contemporary course in German history in that university, in that German university at that time, was a course called Women and Society in the 19th Century, and it ended in 1914. It ended in 1914. There was nothing else in the curriculum. I'm not making this up. I mean, I couldn't make this up. And it was emblematic of how difficult it was for the Germans to come to terms with their own past. Now, however, the proposition is reversed. The best scholarship now being published about the Nazi period and about the Holocaust is being published by young German historians in their 30s and in their 40s. And now, rather than Professor Smeltzer's book and my book being translated into German so that German historians can use them, the books by German historians are being translated into English so we can use them. And my remarks tonight come from this book. And if there are any of you out there who want to read one book that will open to you vistas on how a great modern industrial state recruited from among its best and its brightest to engage in genocide, this is the book, An Uncompromising Generation, by young German historian Michael Wilt. It's just been translated. This is the University of Chicago Press edition. Now, what else can we draw from this? I think, finally, this comes to mind. If I look back over my academic career at what has been published about the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, it is a staggering aggregate sum of work. Articles, essays, speeches, books, particularly books. Have we exhausted the subject? By no means. Have we come close to exhausting the subject? By no means. We've only really begun to try to understand how this happened and why. When the decisions that were made that crossed that boundary line from the climate of killing to the culture of murder. And how and why so many Jewish communities throughout Europe, not just Germany and Austria, but throughout Europe, were obliterated. And where the historical remains and the artifacts of these Jewish communities are. Because in many of these communities, if not most of them, the victims, working rapidly under the lengthening shadow of destruction, the victims managed to create records that they then hid from the Germans, that, as in the case of the Ringelblum archives in the Warsaw Ghetto and the Chronicles of the Lodz Ghetto, records that are yet to be found and to be examined. We're just beginning with this subject. Now, if there are questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them, unless there are people who have drifted into slumber and you're tired of hearing me rant and rave. It would help if the light were just down just a little bit so I could see if anybody. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, sir. Gentleman back here. Or lady, I'm sorry. I can't see. Obviously, we need the light down. Yeah.
Education is stopping them from being part of genocide. What was Hitler's
The question is, in talking about the fact that this cohort in the SS and the police and the SD were all well educated, by contrast, what was Hitler's education like? It was a pretty sorry record. He was a malevolent, misanthropic, indifferent student, arrogant, rebellious. He suffered. Maybe that's too strong. I don't like to use a verb like that when talking about Hitler. But somebody once asked me if it was true that Hitler had syphilis, and I said no. Unfortunately, he never did. But Hitler's home life was such. His father was like 23 years older than his mother, and he had a very difficult relationship with his father. His mother indulged him unbelievably, and after his father died, she indulged him even more. So if he didn't want to go to school, she didn't make him go to school. And when he wanted to spend his time in an art gallery, she let him spend his time in an art gallery. When he wanted to leave home and go to Vienna and live like a bohemian, she supported him financially and let him do that. But he became, in a very warped and tendentious way, he became an extremely well-educated man in the narrow confines of the racist ideology that he absorbed at the time. He had an incredibly retentive memory. I mean, he could read and remember things unbelievably, particularly economic and material data. So to the extent that he was educated, he was self-educated, really. He never finished high school. He never attended university. He tried to get into the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, and he was turned down twice because he didn't have the academic credentials and he didn't have the artistic ability. He was a reject as a result of his education.
So were a lot of the people who were directly around him helping him with everything, were they well educated?
That's a very interesting question. Did everybody hear the question? Were a number of the people around Hitler then well educated if he was not? In the immediate entourage, the immediate circle, the answer is no. But in the next level down, Heydrich's level, the answer is resoundingly yes. Now, Heinrich Himmler was born in 1900. So he was just barely able to be military age at the end of the First World War. He was in training as an officer cadet when the war ended, so he didn't see combat. Hitler, of course, was of the older generation that did see combat. But it's this younger generation that's ideal, that in the Nazi sense is idealistic and zealous and fanatical, that are all these highly educated young men. The older Nazis, the prime Nazis, not so much, with the exception perhaps of Rudolf Hess, who had been a student of the geopolitician historian Karl Haushofer at the University of Munich. Yes, ma'am.
How many people knew about what was going on? I mean, do we know exactly how far up and down the knowledge went?
The question of the ages. The question was, do we know how many people knew in Germany? Hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Let me reduce this to one anecdote. It's a story about a train sitting on a siding in Frankfurt, Germany in 1943. And the rail yards had been bombed to the east and the west. And the train sat on a siding near the main station where commuter trains also came and went, and passenger trains came and went. And this train, which was about 20 boxcars, sat there for 2 or 3 days while the tracks were being repaired. Those boxcars were stuffed with Dutch and Belgian Jews. 60, 80, 100 to a boxcar. sitting there day after day, the cars. The people in the cars able only to stand. Everybody coming and going could hear the moans and the cries and the pleas for help, the begging for water and food. They could see the urine and the excrement coming from beneath the planks and the floors of the cars on the ground. They could smell that train. Now, we don't know how many thousands of people came and went, but if they could say that they didn't know, it's because they chose to be blind, deaf, and dumb. And there's no kidding, they knew what that was, and they knew where those people were headed. The historian Raoul Hilberg has said that the destruction of the European Jews would not have been possible without the willing acceptance of the challenge, the challenge to efficient bureaucratic management posed by the task of murdering 11 million people. Mass murder is hard work. It requires ingenuity. It requires initiative. It requires enterprise. It requires all of the attributes that one would apply to the endeavor of achieving success in anything else. And the Germans set themselves to that. Hundreds of thousands were involved. Station masters, railroad schedule makers, officials in the transport ministry, the post office, which was responsible for part of the signals and communication, the German Eastern Railway network, the police, the army. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, not only knew, but were involved in one way or another. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What did, Lena and all of the wives of these head officials think about what was going on? Were a lot of them very aware of it? Did they help?
I don't think you could say that they helped to the extent that let's just take the SS. Many of these men had very difficult relationships with their wives. Himmler's marriage was a disaster, and he didn't live with his wife. He had a mistress that he lived with and by whom he had a child. Heydrich was henpecked. Lena Heydrich was high maintenance, and she enjoyed being high maintenance. When they were living when he was the acting Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia, he was Hitler's viceroy in Prague. They lived in an estate, a castle north of Prague, Pinansky Brezhany, and she liked to come out in the front yard and tell her friends who were there visiting or something, she, "Look, it's a fairy tale, and I'm a princess, and here's the castle." They had no influence and no role in either abetting or mitigating what their husbands were doing. Most of the husbands didn't talk to their wives about what went on. The extent to which they knew, of course, is debatable, but in some measure they knew. They all knew. Margot Himmler knew. Lena Heydrich knew. The wives of these other SS principals had to know what was going on. And in most of the postings where these young SS men were, their wives were permitted to go and live near the front. Otto Rasch, Erich Erlinger, and I think Sandberger. If it wasn't Sandberger, it was maybe Horst Burma. Their wives lived with them in quarters in Prague and in Russia while they were engaged in Einsatzgruppen work. Finally, a gentleman's asking a question over here.